So anyway, but without further ado, I'd like to kick off our event, why we're all here this evening, with Bruce Epperly. I don't have a formal introduction prepared for Bruce Epperly, but Bruce is both a minister and has a doctorate and is a theologian. Has written more books than many other people that I know, most other people that I know. He's always got new books coming out. And he was a professor of mine when I was at Claremont School of Theology. It was like 10 years ago now that we were in those classes together. And I very much greatly appreciate not only Bruce's scholarship and his expression of process thinking in such accessible terms, but also his support and generosity as a colleague. He's always been such a great supporter of mine and all of his other students and colleagues. And Bruce, what we're here to talk about today is one of his most recent books called The Elephant is Running. The subtitle is Process and Open and Relational Theologies and Religious Pluralism. So with that, I'll turn it over to Bruce. Bruce will tell us about his topic for a little bit of time, and then I'll maybe respond a little bit with a question or two, and then we'll open it up for dialogue. So please hang around and be part of that. Bruce.
Well, thank you, Sherry, and thanks to all of you who are here this evening. It's good to see the faces and to see colleagues in school as when I was Mary Elizabeth Moore, and reunite, albeit digitally, students like Sherry, friends from my church in Bethesda, Maryland, where I'm a member and not a pastor. I'm in theory retired, which gives me more opportunity to teach and to write, which is a good thing. And friends new and old, and to the process community. Meister Eckhart once made the comment that if the only prayer you can make is thank you, that will suffice. And I want to, again, always begin with thanking my teachers. My teachers as well as my students, but my teachers back in the day were John Cobb and David Griffin and Bernard Loomer. And then before that, at San Jose State, where I went as an undergraduate, Richard Keedy, who's, I believe, still in the Claremont area, and also Marie Fox, who taught me Plato and Whitehead, which ended up being the theme of my dissertation many years later. So I'm grateful for them and grateful for you showing up this evening. And I'll talk a little bit about the text, and I think the most fun happens in the conversation, I think. But obviously, many of you have heard of the story of the sight-impaired people and the elephant, although it might be updated today to be people with blindfolds on, so to avoid the ableist sort of stigma. There is a story, as told in South Asia originally, I believe, of a group of people who are sight impaired who hear about this strange creature. And they go to experience the creature. And each one of them touches a different part of this creature, this elephant, and each one identifies certain aspects of it. The leg, the trunk, the torso, the tusks, the tail, and each one assumes that that is the elephant and nothing more. The story probably originally was told to speak of the limitations of people's religious experiences and also the danger of saying that what I experience is the whole truth and nothing but the truth. Now, the story also has a positive message because each one of the people experiences the elephant, right? And the problem is that they say this is the elephant and nothing more. Now, for years, I'd been pondering a new way of looking at this story. And as a matter of fact, I rolled it out when Sherry was my student in Whitehead and Religious Pluralism in the fall of 2012 at Claremont. And I always subtitle my classes because the title the registrar gives you often really isn't the title you want to have. And it was all, the subtitle was The Elephant is Running, because How many of you have ever seen a living elephant that didn't move? Living elephants move, don't they? Their ears are flapping. Their tail is moving. Their trunk ingests water and then squirts it out at you. They can really gallop, and then you have to hang on for dear life, or then you might have to grab another part of the elephant. The elephant in this story is perhaps the ultimate reality, God, the holy, whatever name you want to call her. It is the divine. And the divine, in the story I've added to, is moving. And what's even more interesting is that the people who believe they're experiencing God or the holy are also moving, right? If you've ever gone horseback riding, you know, especially out in the mountains, Tom Ord should be here to talk about this, you have to hold on in different ways on the horse if you're going to stay on, right? And so when an elephant is moving, you touch different parts of the elephant than where you started, or the horse than where you started. Religions are living things. Our own experience of the holy is living. The divine itself is living and constantly changing. And revelation, while it may very well be universal, and I believe it is also personal and relational and changing. The elephant is running. Now, in some ways, this book is biographical or autobiographical. I mean, you get to be a certain age, and I'm that certain age, where you don't write anything unless there's passion behind it. And this book, in a way, tells my story beneath and under the lines. I was raised in the Salinas Valley in California. If any one of you has driven from up Highway 101, I was raised in King City. It's a place you drive by if you have to get gas and whatnot. There's a good taco stand in town, some of the best street tacos you'll get everywhere in King City. It was a small town. I was raised in an evangelical Baptist church there, the Community Baptist Church. My dad was the pastor. And I was a child who had mystical experiences. I truly felt as I walked along the Salinas River that God walked with me and talked with me and told me I was his own, as the old song goes. I was baptized in a revival meeting. It's a very humorous story. There was a cowboy evangelist who came into town because Baptists need to be revived on a regular basis. And he was a cowboy evangelist to the stars. And he had a lariat, and the name of his evangelistic tour revival was the Roundup for God. Put your foot in the stirrup, climb up on the horse, the Roundup for God was on. And I had a dateable conversion experience at about 9 years old. It lasted till I was a teenager and my family moved to San Jose. And I discovered before the era of deconstructionism, that I deconstructed my faith. The Baptist religion of small town America was too small, too cramped. And by that time, I'd lost the evangelical revival fervor. I found it in reading as a teenager, the Transcendentalists, and they introduced me to the Buddhists and the Hindus. And of course, it was the mid to late 60s. A golden era in the San Francisco Bay Area, by the way. And of course, I took all sorts of adventures on what Steppenwolf described as the magic carpet ride. Sometimes I found more than a lousy candle. But that was my world. When I was a first-year student in college, I learned transcendental meditation at the Students International Meditation Society ashram in Berkeley, California, and never looked back. I became interested in going back to church, interestingly enough, and had what might call a gradual conversion. And of course, I think we're converted every minute of our lives. A gradual conversion of going back to a progressive Baptist church in San Jose, California, where I was going to school. My life has been a little bit like the people I talk about in the book. Because when I learned transcendental meditation, I all of a sudden became interested not just in Buddhist mysticism, but in Christian mysticism. Later on, I was studying death and dying and holistic medicine, and I became interested in Reiki and then became a Reiki master teacher about 25 years ago. I will say that I wrote the first book on Christianity and Reiki, Reiki Healing Touch in the Way of Jesus, about 15 years ago or so. And Reiki introduced me to the healings of Jesus in a new way, such that I could claim that the healings of Jesus in the New Testament were not just aberrations, but real events that could occur, not supernaturally, but naturalistically. And of course, process theology helped me understand that the holy could be present in very significant ways that transform our bodies, minds, and spirits that don't defy what's orderly for us. Now, this is a bit of my story, but it's also the story of a lot of other people, isn't it? A lot of other people who have discovered that allegiance to one faith and one faith alone is not sufficient. They become global and cosmopolitan people. Global Christians, perhaps, cosmopolitan Christians, or perhaps we use the words interspiritual and hybrid today, don't we? We hear those words a lot. People who are in the church choir and then go to a Zen Buddhist retreat on the weekend. People who are pastors, and pastors are often in the closet about this, and I've been trying over my last many years to liberate pastors. Pastors who are congregational pastors and also learning Hindu meditation, or perhaps one of the healing arts like medical Qigong or Reiki, and are uncertain whether they should tell their congregants about that. This book had a 10-year journey in writing it, and it began with Sherry's class in the fall of 2012. And then in 2021, during the height of the COVID pandemic, I taught it on Zoom to people in the congregation I was pastoring, historic UCC Church on Cape Cod, and people who were friends across the country. And it inspired me to start writing. It was test-driven with grad students and lay people. And if lay people can get it, and sometimes they're the sharpest people around, it then becomes something worth writing about. The heart of the book could be described not only as my journey or the journey of people in a variety of religious traditions, from First American to pagan to Buddhist to Confucian/Ruist to other traditions, but also the heart of the book is what I'd call theo-spirituality. That's a term of my own coinage. It's the belief, very similar to Whitehead's journey of the airplane. You know, Whitehead says that the philosophical journey begins with on-the-ground experience, goes up into the heavens to try to universalize, and then touches down again. As I looked at the religions of the world and my own religion as a progressive Christian, influenced by process and open relational theologies, it seemed to me that religious traditions really find their livelihood and energy in experience. First comes the experience. Then comes our attempt to create a field in which it makes sense. And then that field that makes sense has to always be created, always understood in terms of concrete experiences. And the process goes on and on and on and constantly changes. And the field of both experience and attempt to understand it now is global and not parochial. The field now is both the attempt to understand, but the concreteness of people's experiences. many of us are, again, interspiritual. That is, we have a home base, but we also adventure. One of the most curious encounters in an interview, and perhaps Luke knows this person, I think. You were contemporaries at Lancaster Theological Seminary when I was one of the deans there and taught. Cindy Simpson. Cindy's a Unitarian Universalist witch, a pagan. And when Cindy and I were talking, and she said, well, Cindy, and Cindy and I grew very much like Sherry from student to peer. I said, Cindy, by your definition of witchcraft, I'm a witch. And she looked at me in that strange way that friends do over the years and said, well, Bruce, of course you are. And learning people's stories was very much at the heart of my work, because God deliver us from abstractions. God deliver us from abstractions. Abstractions are the source of most of our problems in interreligious dialogue, as well as ethics, as well as the issues of sexuality. Concreteness is our salvation, smart concreteness. Well, in my own thinking about this, and I always write books pretty much that I need to figure something out, so I write about it or teach it, or because I have a passion about it. One of the advantages of being at a certain stage of your professional life where you have reached the rank of professor and nothing you do will improve your lot, and where you have done all you need to do in terms of the publish and perish world, is you simply do things because you love them, or you need to learn. And in the learning of and encountering about 16 traditions in this text, 3 things I was trying to do, and 3 questions were motivating me. The first was, speaking as a Christian, what can we learn? Again, our task is to listen first. Our task is to listen to other people's stories, to not fill in the blanks before they've spoken, to not assume we know someone's tradition, to listen to their stories, to, as Nell Morton in Claremont used to say, to hear folks into speech, to listen to how they understand their faith and figure out what we can learn. I hear the we for me as a progressive Christian from their religious story. And every one of the religious traditions can teach us something. Every tradition can teach us something, because every tradition captures a little bit of the holy that perhaps we haven't. Again, I don't know whether there's such a thing as a trinity or quaternity. It probably doesn't make a lot of sense to argue that point. But the one thing that doctrine points to is that God's self is multifaceted. That God is like that moving elephant with all sorts of ways we can encounter God. And as a evangelical Christian, I learned that you have a personal relationship to Jesus, which suggests that God may be approaching you in a unique, intimate way that's somewhat different than your neighbor, and maybe approaching a culture or cultures plural in somewhat different ways than the culture next door. That the varieties of religious experience and religious traditions are not falls from grace, but expressions of the call and response of life and the diversity of God and human experience. So the first thing was, what can we learn? The second was, what can we share? Do Christians have something we can share with other traditions of great humility, gifts that can either be taken or not? What gift that we have that would help another tradition live itself more faithfully, or at least enjoy life more, or at least find interesting? And finally, how can we practice together? How can we practice together? That there is that we can sit and pray with one another. I remember years ago, some preacher made the comment that God doesn't hear the prayers of Muslims. Well, I'm not in a position to know what God hears or doesn't. That's way above my pay grade, as Barack Obama used to say. But I'm in a position to say, if there is a God, I don't think God's particular about whose prayers God hears. That all prayers and all experiences are in that call and response, and invites us to practice together. I mean, one of the interesting joys of my pastoral ministry on Cape Cod was, again, I was at a certain point of my career, I thought I might be a seminary president, decided I was delivered from that, had some close calls, was delivered from that, and decided to pastor a historic church on Cape Cod. And when I got there and was interviewed, I said, and I was Congregationalist, so that means they have to decide they want to accept you. I said, well, you know, I want you to know who I am. I'm a Universalist. And I believe that other folks outside Christianity are saved and God loves them. Is that going to be a problem to you? Well, they hired me anyway. They called me anyway. But one of the first things I did since they called me in the summer was to begin to have a summer solstice service, because I believed that it was important for Christians to be earth-based. And of course, Christianity is earth-based. There's no contrariness. That's what the incarnation is about. And so we did all the seasonal services that our pagan friends were doing in a Christian way and in a pagan way, both. And pagans as well as Christians came, and sometimes they shared poetry and things like that. And it was actually one of the greatest evangelistic efforts of our church, because people discovered they could go to a church where they didn't have to sign some sort of creed to be there, but they were called to be spirited people from wherever they came on life's journey. So the elephant is running. God is running. The Holy is running. Herself is running. The ultimate is running. Abide with me, fast falls the eventide. In all the changes of life, there is creativity and wonder, and we can indeed be radically amazed, or be, as Heschel says, be astonished, as Mary Oliver says, and then tell about it. Well, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
That was great, Bruce. Thank you so much for those excellent reflections. So I want to point out, and you touched on this when you talked about the questions that you asked. But first, even before I get to what I want to point out, I want to just mention that you cover so many different traditions in this book. You know, you talk about Christianity and process thinking at the start, but then you cover Judaism, Zoroastrianism, Islam, Baha'i, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, the Sikhs, Confucianism, Ruism, Taoism, Shinto, earth-based and pagan spirituality, Native and First American, Yoruba and its spiritual children, the New Age and new spiritual movements, and then have a final chapter on spiritualities in the making. And in each chapter, what I really thought is so valuable about this book, and I would highly recommend it for any groups that are wanting to do a study, of pluralistic approach to religion, especially, for church groups or anything like that. I would really recommend it. But what is, I think, really interesting about the approach that you take in this book, Bruce, is that each chapter, begins with looking at the tradition that you're addressing. And then you really dig into sort of the heart of that tradition and present their own, sort of key essence aspects. And then but then you talk about what Christians can learn from that tradition. Then you also have, maybe this is before what Christians can learn, but you always have an interview with a practitioner of that faith. And so that just adds that real concrete element that you talk about. And then you talk about what Christians can learn. And then you also touch on what Christianity's gift could be to that tradition. And then you end with some kind of practice. So it really covers such a nice span of reflection. And you're also clearly approaching each tradition from your own stance as someone in the Christian faith as your primary location. So I wonder if you just might say a little bit about what prompted you to take that approach to each tradition, because obviously you could have other approaches, religious studies approaches that are just about the history, but you took a really different approach here.
Yeah, and there's a certain risk to that, because the risk is getting it all wrong on somebody's tradition.
Yeah.
But I decided to follow I did obviously wide primary source reading, and made the apology at the very beginning that I'm seeing this with my lenses, and that there's not just one Jainism, there's multiple Jainisms. There's not just one Christianity, there's multiple Christianities. There are different traditions of paganism. And that so you have to come at it humbly. I guess it reflects my own spiritual approach, that I think spirituality, and maybe I'm still that kid who came forward at the revival meeting, the Roundup for God, that beyond the doctrine of churches are people who have experienced the holy. And if you encounter the person who's experienced the holy, all of a sudden you neither have to defend your faith. Somebody recently called me in some document an apologist for Christianity. And I don't think I've ever described myself as that. I don't think faith needs to defend itself against the hordes and vandals and Viscos out there. I'm an affirmer of faith, not an apologist for faith. I don't have to worry about otherness. It really reflects my own spirituality in many ways, because I am interested in learning from everyone. I think one of the delights of being both a minister and a professor is you can ask people questions. And once they realize you aren't that kind of minister, they'll talk to you and share their hearts, and you have to have a profound curiosity. And I really also saw this as a methodology I've tried to live by politically and culturally, is that there's no one right answer to most questions, that there's many possible ways of looking at life that are legitimate in their field, in their context. And let there be, as Rumi says, 100 ways to kneel and touch and kiss the ground. And I think, again, we're better when we dialogue than when we stay in our silo.